One flame up, keep you strong. 'Cause it's coming through you. It's coming through you. These days you're holding on.
It's a French beer.
Ice cold French coconut LaCroix. Well, welcome to the Best Movie Ever podcast. My name is Joel Rafey.
My name is Sarah Mullins.
And today we're going to be comparing Chicago. Is it 2002 Chicago? God, I'm the host of a movie podcast. I don't even know when the fucking movie came out. And 1929's Broadway Melody, not to be confused with 1945's Broadway Melody. Or there's like 5 of them out there, but 1929, that's the one we watched.
Do we know, I feel like we should have researched this beforehand. Do we know if the 1945 Broadway Melody is like the same plot or if it's a completely different movie?
We're adamant professionals here, and I have no idea what you're talking about. The first one we watched was the Broadway Melody, and it was the first talkie to win a Academy Award, or Best Picture, I should say. Prior to that, Wings was the very first Best Picture winner, and that was a silent film about planes, I think. We haven't seen that one yet.
No, that's for later
That's
on.
coming. But this is the Broadway Melody. It was the second Best Picture to win ever. And boy, I don't even know if you could consider this one a movie.
Well, okay, it has a main character. I'm not sure. It doesn't follow the traditional hero's journey in any sense of the word. It is staged more like a play than anything else.
They had some interesting ideas, I thought, because the movie opens with this kind of, I think his name is Eddie, the main character?
Eddie's singing the title song.
Yeah.
In the first scene.
He walks into his office, and it's sort of a cacophony of sound. There's like people practicing for this or that everywhere in the office, and he seems to be like a composer of Broadway music. And you'd think if that scene was shot today, it would play a little bit better, but my ears were bleeding after the first like 30 seconds of this movie start.
Yeah, the song is not a good song. I would not characterize it as being a good, fun musical number.
No, and it is the Broadway Melody. That's the first actual song we hear without, the 3-4 other songs playing in the background. And it's fine, but the movie opens with it, and then you hear it no less than 5 other times over the course of it. And we watched the trailer to this thing, and it looked like a musical. Like, you're going to get 10, 12 songs in this thing.
Well, it's not like you look at West Side Story and Sound of Music, which are both other musical Academy Award winners, and it has, I want to say, 2 separate songs in the entire film.
Well, there's the Broadway Melody, and then we'll get to it later. There's a Roman number. I don't recall the...
Oh, yeah.
So it might be 3 songs.
I
There's the
forgot about that.
Roman number, which I can't be sure if they were speaking English during. I don't know if it was the mix quality on the movie itself, but it sounds fucking terrible. It just sounded like 20 people muttering, and then of course our lead, one of our leads, is standing on the bow of a ship during this. But it is freakishly bad, and I'm gonna say overall there's a ton of elements of this film that are freakishly terrible, but not unfunny. Everything freakishly terrible in this film is also quite hilarious to a modern audience, I'd say.
It's sort of hard to, it's hard to pinpoint whether it's about Broadway or if it's about vaudeville or both. I'm a little unclear.
Well, let's get into the plot, because the plot is a little strange. Eddie, I keep wanting to call him Jimmy. I'll call him Jimmy at least one time during this. But Eddie has these 2 gals, these 2 sisters who he's friends with, and we learn more about them as it goes on. But
not very much at the same time.
No. They come in at maybe the 15-minute mark of the movie, and then they're in pretty much every scene after that. But Eddie has this song, the Broadway Melody, that he wants to get in Ziegfeld's. Is it Ziegfeld's?
It's not. I want to say it's not Ziegfeld, but it's a similar name.
Zanfield.
Yes.
Zanfield. He wants to get into Zanfield's musical. And it's a fine song, but even like the moment where he performs it for Zanfield, he's just like, nah, it's okay. He doesn't really give a shit about it, but he goes to pitch it, I guess, to these two women, one of which is his current girlfriend.
Yes, Hank.
Hank and Queenie
Is Hank's sister.
Yeah, so he goes to see the two sisters,
and I guess Queenie. I wouldn't say that Queenie. The actress apparently was a very it's considered to be very attractive.
Well, she was thought to be the most attractive
silent film star.
Yes.
Yes.
And that just sort of plays out throughout this entire movie. There's so many times where actors are just like, oh my God, she's so beautiful. She's the most beautiful woman.
You sort of just see every single time one of the male characters sees her for the first time, their face just perks up like, oh,
yeah.
Oh, she's beautiful. I'd like to do things to her.
And oh, the things characters try to do to these poor girls. I believe the first time we see them, a busboy comes in and they do a trick to not have to tip the busboy. In that same scene, we also get a very weird kiss between the two sisters that goes on a little bit too long.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of kisses in this movie that go on a little bit too long.
There's some subtext there that I don't know if they really intended.
Well, I thought, because we don't explicitly see that they're sisters or hear that they're sisters in the beginning, so I thought, oh my God, we're getting like two lesbian lovers in this 1929 movie. This was a little risque.
It was, I mean, for a movie of that time period, I was a little excited because I was like, oh, they were really lawless before some strange laws came into town.
But instead of the Broadway lesbians, I would call this one the Broadway threesome.
Yes.
Because the moment Eddie walks in, he kisses
both of them directly on the lips. He goes to Hank, his girlfriend, and then he goes to Queenie and kisses Queenie just as long, if not longer, than Hank. Well, he has that same look when he first sees her, like, oh, she's all grown up now, and I want a piece of that.
Yeah, and every time we cut to Queenie in one of these sequences, there's this sort of weird, like, Vaseline on the lens treatment the filmmakers have done, where it obviously cuts to a different camera with a different lens, and she's standing in a very different position than the last one we just saw. Mm-hmm. It must have been like a stylistic motif at the time, but it's incredibly jarring that when anytime Eddie would stare at her, it would just get this sort of dreamlike Vaseline wiped on the lens effect. But so he basically goes, I can get you in this musical. You have to come down and sing for Zanfield, and you'll get in, no questions asked. What happens immediately thereafter is a very strange cat fight at a piano between, I guess, another woman who Eddie knows and wants to get in,
so
and then the two sisters.
Yeah, she comes back later, but she, I guess, wanted the part in the song in Broadway Melody originally from the first scene where he sings it for the first time. And so I guess there's some bad blood there. And
there's a bit of a cat fight, and then Zanfield like storms off. He's like, I don't want anything to do with this musical number. I don't want anything to do with these two girls. He storms off, and I believe it's
Queenie goes up to Mr. Zanfield.
Yeah.
And basically flashes a little bit of skin, and
well, then she like leaves. She walks off. It must be Queenie then. She goes like, oh, I'll talk to Zanfield, and she walks off screen while Hank and Eddie are talking, and comes back like 30 seconds later, like, we did it, we're in the show. And all I could think of and wrote down in my notes was, wow, that was the quickest blowjob ever.
Yep.
And then he says that the two gals are going to be in it, but then actually during the performance, during the dress rehearsal, they dance, and then Zanfield's like, no, cut those broads out. We don't want them in there. So then it's just Eddie doing it, and so presumably the girls aren't going to get a part in this fucking musical.
Except that Zanfield still likes Queenie. He thinks she's hot stuff.
And yeah, there's a part that opens up very unexpectedly because a young woman is sitting on or standing on the bow of a ship, and without anything to prompt it, she just takes a dive off the top. I guess gets seriously injured or dies, and then they're like, "Oh shit, we need a blonde now." And then Queenie gets a part in this musical, and oh boy, does she act! She acts so good. Her part is to stand on the bow of a ship and look pretty and do absolutely nothing for 5 minutes while 10 to 20 Roman guys and like a harem of women sing the weirdest fucking song ever.
Mm-hmm. And you can't understand anything that they're saying. You don't know what's going on. Like usually when you're watching, like, say, an opera that's in a different language, you can usually, from context clues, figure out what's happening in the opera, even if you don't know the language. But there was none of this. You could not fathom what was happening.
Well, there was very little movement, if any, during the song. I couldn't distinguish any real words. This was one of the first times I checked out, because in this film, I mean, it opens with these two girls taking a bath together and then kissing, and you're like, what the fuck is this, 1929? And then you get to these like very slow musical numbers, and I thought for sure the musical numbers in the Broadway Melody were going to be the best part, and they weren't. It was just the weird sexual tension between sisters. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about the plot of this movie, and it's funny because there really isn't very much of it.
There's not a lot there. The basic crux of the plot is basically that these two girls go to New York City. They want to get on Broadway as a double act, and Hank is very talented. Queenie's very pretty, basically.
But we haven't brought up I can't remember his name, but the shithole character.
So the classic rich douchebag, Jacques.
Jacques, yeah.
Because he's French.
Jacques, Mr. Warner is his, so it must be Jacques Warner. Yeah, he is the guy who is constantly trying to get with Queenie, and Eddie is going like, oh my God, Queenie, you can't possibly get with that guy because I want to get with you, and I happen to be in a relationship with your sister right now, but that's fine. That's gonna go away. You're gonna be with me, not with Jacques. So there's all this like weird, these weird scenes where like he's like, no, you can't be with that guy because and then he doesn't say anything.
Well, and Hank also says she shouldn't be with this guy, but it's for a pretty legitimate reason, considering that he literally just buys things for Queenie, and of course, as in the old world, expects some output in return.
I mean, he doesn't do anything terrible to anyone at first. So every question about like, oh, you shouldn't go out with this guy, you shouldn't hang out with him, is sort of just, we just see it through Eddie, like wanting to get with Queenie himself. So there really is nothing terrible he's doing to her except staring at her ass and buying her a rose bush at one point. But then there does come a scene where he does push himself on Queenie, and you're like, oh yeah, well, this guy's obviously a piece of shit. Eddie goes to try to save her, gets punched and then thrown out in a very strange bit of fight choreography where like the punch doesn't land, but yet he ends up being flung out the door. It's a very like theatrical moment.
Eddie and Hank have been telling her that she shouldn't go on a date with this guy. She shouldn't go out with him, blah, 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 blah. And finally, she's like, no, I'm going to go out with him. There's nothing you can do to stop me. They're in the dressing room at the theater after everything. And both Hank and Eddie are upset that she's going. She disappears, and Hank, who has basically figured out that they're in love with each other, sort of tells Eddie that he should go after Queenie and get her, and that she doesn't love him. And then immediately following Eddie running off to go rescue Queenie, you have probably the best acting in the entire movie, where Hank reacts to Eddie leaving her, and you see that she clearly does love Eddie, but she's sacrificed basically her entire life so that her sister can be happy.
That particular moment holds up even today. You're like, holy shit, like this girl's pretty good. You don't really give a shit about any of the other characters at this moment because Hank is the only redeemable character in it.
Because she's strong. She's clearly the most talented character that is in the movie, and she is the most empathetic and self-sacrificing, and you feel for her, whereas everybody else is rather one-dimensional, I would say.
So Hank is the epitome of the protagonist in this, and she just kind of gets shit on in the end of it too, because we just randomly cut at the end of the film to Queenie and Eddie have come back from their honeymoon, and Hank is just getting in a carriage about to leave town.
Yeah, she's gonna go on the road, I guess. Where was it that she was gonna be performing? Like Schenectady or something?
Yeah. It was like, oh, it's better to be a star in Schenectady than a has-been in New York City.
Yeah.
So Hank just sort of gives up and leaves New York, and that is the last moment of the film. Yeah.
It's the most depressing ending for the most redeemable character, and you're kind of left with, what are we supposed to feel about the end of this movie?
It kind of gave me this weird, like, uneasy feeling watching it, but I don't know if that was the intention of the filmmaker, because then it, like, the music cues up and you see roaring Times Square where everyone can be a star, but then our main character is leaving because she's like, oh, I guess I couldn't make it here. Oops. The Broadway Melody, would you recommend anyone to watch it? 1929. You can rent it on Amazon Prime or like a PlayStation. I think we did Amazon Prime because it was a little bit cheaper. But would you recommend anyone streams this movie?
I think the only thing I would recommend is the meme video you made of it. That's the...
Oh, we didn't even talk about the bracelet part.
We didn't talk about it, but I'm bringing it up now because we can't not talk about it.
There's a scene where the actress Bessie Love, who's the blonde who plays Queenie, she comes back after she's just seen Jacques, and they've gotten very drunk at a party, where I believe the Broadway Melody plays in the background for probably the fourth time at that moment of the movie. And she walks stumbles in to the apartment where her and Hank are staying, very drunkenly, very Marx Brothers-esque, and then walks up to the bed and goes like, hey, look what I got, and just starts playing with her bracelet. And it goes on far too long. I did an edit up of it that's on the channel of it going just a little bit too far as she's just like drunkenly staring at it, as Hank just like glares at her from across the room like, you bitch. And then, at the very end, Queenie's just like, yeah, see this bracelet? That's class, that is. It is a ridiculous scene and one of the biggest laughs I've had watching a movie on this show so far. Mm-hmm. So if only that, this movie gave me, like, tears streaming down my face laughter. I loved that part of it. If you were going to watch this movie with a group of friends who are all, like, film buffs, I would say you would have a great time watching it.
If you turn it into a drinking game,
yeah,
absolutely.
God, you take a shot every time you hear Broadway Melody, your ass is going to be on the floor by the end of it. I mean, if you were drinking with friends and you wanted to have a good time, sure. If you were interested in seeing one of the first talkies, sure, go watch this movie. But it has a 35% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. This is the lowest scored movie on our show that we're gonna watch, and my God, I mean, it wasn't a prestige movie, like it wasn't Godfather, but man, I didn't think they were gonna get this bad.
It was real bad. There were so many parts where, I mean, there were little moments that I thought were really funny, unintentionally so, but there were so many parts where I just completely checked out. I was so bored that, I wouldn't want to sit through it again, I don't think.
Well, I wasn't bored so much until it randomly cuts to a play that one of them is in. It's probably Eddie is in, and it cuts from like action to this musical number at like maybe like the 3/4 of the way through the film, and I checked out right then at that part. But I was sort of giddy with how bad it was, and just every time something happened that you would never see in a film today, it just got me excited and really giddy. So I was enjoying it for probably the first 3/4, and then I really checked out. I couldn't tell you what happened in this last like 30 minutes, with the exception of, you know, the great scenes between Hank and Eddie. But no, overall, I wouldn't recommend seeing the Broadway Melody. But if you want a good laugh and you're interested in seeing like a fun black and white movie, or you want to see like this great piece of movie history, then yeah, of course, go back and watch the film. I mean, we live in a time now where you can go on Amazon Prime and rent a movie from 1929 and watch it. Whereas maybe, you know, 20 years ago, finding this movie would be a little difficult, I think.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So
I don't know where, like, you wouldn't, like, if Amazon didn't exist, where you could order even a DVD copy of it or something. I mean, there might not even been DVD or VHS copies of it.
Yeah, so I mean, we live in an era where you're able to actually go out and just sit down on your couch and watch a movie from 1929 instantly. So that was kind of a great realization I had just doing this series, was all these movies are out there. You know, even if it's an old film, you can find it. So that was great. The realization that you can actually find this movie in 2019 and watch it with a couple drinks with your film buff friends and have a good time. I had a good time overall. I wouldn't recommend watching it, but I had a pretty good time. Yeah, that's pretty much all I have.
Yeah, that pretty much sums it up.
Yeah. A bit of trivia about the actress who plays Hank. Her name is Anita Page. She won, you know, we were talking about how great she was in that one scene. She won the Best Actress award this year. And after this film came out, she was making a $3,000 a week at MGM as part of like a stipend. And all her other male co-stars were making roughly $1,000 a week at the time. And I mean, $3,000 a week in 1930s is a shit ton of money. So this woman was making, you know, just baller money at the time, and about 3 times as much as any of her male counterparts. So Hollywood definitely loved Anita Page. She was in a ton of movies too. She was in a couple with Clark Gable and Buster Keaton, and just at the time one of the highest paid actresses on MGM's roster, and died very recently and just around here. She died in 2008 at age 98 in Van Nuys, California. So she lived a long, fruitful life. Was very successful even in her later years in life. Did sort of a comeback and was in a bunch of horror films in like the early 2000s. All right, so our second movie this week was 2002's Chicago, which has a lot more music in it than the Broadway Melody. I'll say that first of all. And I was tapping my toes, I was snapping my fingers, I was singing all the songs after that movie was over. Was it a great movie? We'll see. But the songs themselves are coming from a musical that has a huge, rich history.
Yes.
So the music, I mean, I know and love Chicago as a theater kid. I went to a theater school and did musical theater a lot. And I must have, as a musical theater boy, must have sang every single song that a male sings in this musical. Auditions, I've seen the fucking Cell Block Tango every year of my life. Some group of young women did it. So I wasn't. I went into this having seen it once before. I love the musical, and I can't say I love the entire movie, but I was entertained enough. But I mean, I knew every song that was coming up, so it didn't blow my socks off or anything, but it was still very entertaining. What are your initial thoughts on Chicago?
Well, I mean, as a kid, I dabbled in theater throughout elementary, middle school, and high school, but I didn't consider myself a theater kid. I was more of an art kid. And, but that said, I watched a ton of Disney movies. So like that was probably the closest thing to musicals I had encountered before seeing Chicago in like 2002. Aside from like the big ones, which are like Sound of Music, Wizard of Oz, all that sort of stuff. So that was like the first time I'd seen a new musical come out, and I remember loving the movie when it came out. I was obsessed with it. I watched it probably about 1,000 times, and I have the movie memorized by heart as a result. But I think it ignited a love of musicals at the time that I had not had before, and so I ended up exploring musicals even further after that.
Well, I think this particular musical has a couple big stars in it. It also was the first musical to win Best Picture since Oliver. So Oliver was in the late 60s. This is 2002. So I mean, it's a big swath of time where no musicals won anything. And this movie, I'll give it, opens very, very well. I thought Renee Zellweger and Catherine Zeta-Jones did a fantastic job in the roles. I also thought that Richard Gere did a fine job. Not a great job, but it was fine. For me, it was like, oh, look, Richard Gere can sing. That's fun. But I mean, you put any other person in that part, and it would have been the same performance to me.
I would say that Richard Gere, like all the other actors in the movie, I think offered a certain amount of nuance to the roles that they were playing. Whereas Richard Gere, you definitely felt more like he was playing just an archetype or a caricature of what the traditional smarmy lawyer who only wants money is going to be like. Whereas even Roxy and like Velma Kelly are undoubtedly bad people. You can't, it's hard to root for any of them. But both of those actresses do such a great job in those roles that you really love those characters, and you want to see them at the end beat their respective murder charges and then be able to move on and reclaim the stage, so to speak.
Yeah, I guess the entire thing does sort of come to a head when the two of them go like, I hate you, you hate me, but listen, if we sing together, they want to see two murderers sing together, and we could make a shit ton of money. And then it escalates to that one musical number, which is pretty much just a one shot of them dancing simultaneously and singing. And it's a great beat in the film. And right after that musical number, the movie's over. So that is the payoff of the entire thing, is seeing this musical number that I believe Catherine Zeta-Jones teases early on by trying to show Roxy in the jail, like, hey, this is what my sister and I used to do. Yeah. You mean the sister you killed? But yeah, the two women in this movie are murderers. They're killers, and most of the fun characters in this movie are terrible people.
Yeah.
Granted, in Roxy's case, she killed her lover because not because he was unfaithful. She was unfaithful to her husband, but because he says, come on, what do you think? I'm going to get you a big part in Hollywood? No, I'm here because you have a nice piece of ass. And she goes like, wait, what do you mean? I'm not going to get in on the big stage.
I want to get into vaudeville, baby.
I want to get into vaudeville, baby. And then she gets pissed at him, grabs a gun and kills him in cold blood there. And then Velma Kelly catches her sister with her husband?
Yes.
Yeah, and then kills them both in the bed. And then we also get another character who a very similar story, who's played by she was in Kill Bill.
Lucy Liu's character.
Lucy Liu, yes. Lucy Liu comes and she kills her husband and two other women who are in the bed with him at the time.
Yes, she's a wealthy heiress. She comes in after going out for the night. She comes in and finds that her husband is in bed with two other women, and she promptly pulls out a gun and shoots all 3 of them.
Yes. And the crux of the plot of this is all of these women want the most publicity possible for the murder that they committed, with the help of Richard Gere's character. But it's like Velma Kelly is the one, Catherine Zeta-Jones's character is the one who's in the limelight. Then Roxy's got a better story. Then Lucy Liu's got a better story. But then Roxy goes, "No, I'm pregnant." And then everyone goes, "Oh shit, this poor girl. She's pregnant and in prison. She's a murderer, but no, you can't let a child be born in prison." So it's all these women trying to get one up on each other. I have a better story. I have a better story. I have a better story. None of them are particularly good people, but they're still very fun to watch. And that is Chicago in a nutshell.
Yeah, I think that the movie's biggest flaw is that the story is very predictable. You know what's going to happen because you know who the protagonist is and how everything's going to work out for her. I would say that this movie's strength and the reason that it probably took the win that year was it is impeccably crafted. All the dance numbers, all the production design, the songs, the music, they're beautifully put together and everything sort of sings together, despite the fact that, like, Richard Gere, for example, is not the most interesting version of that character, I think, that's ever existed on stage or on screen.
No.
But even so, he does a good enough job that you're not left feeling like, oh, this aspect completely ruined the movie. In fact, I would say that the movie overall is a masterpiece, so to speak, but that could also be attributed to the fact that a good portion of the source material for it, the original musical, is a masterpiece.
It's the second longest running Broadway musical behind Phantom of the Opera. So, I mean, it's amazing source material. If you're going to do a musical, you picked a great one to do. The movie won that year. Also, Catherine Zeta-Jones won for Best Supporting Actress, and she deserves that wholeheartely. Even if there are other films that year that you're like, oh, those should have won instead of Chicago, Catherine Zeta-Jones has an athleticism and a star quality in this film that is unmatched by any of her co-stars. Renee Zellweger is great in it. She's really, really great, but Catherine Zeta-Jones really shines in this film.
Well, and it's interesting because Catherine Zeta-Jones got her acting start in musicals on the West End. So it's sort of full circle for her. My connection with Catherine Zeta-Jones is how much I absolutely obsessed about her in the Zorro films.
But I mean, this was also the year like The Pianist, The Hours adaptation came out. I mean, there was some big movies that came out that year. But I mean, I think people just wanted a fun musical. I mean, that just comes around once in a while. Like,
yeah,
just a really fun movie will often win it. And this one is expertly edited, and the sound mixing on it is amazing. It's a fun movie. If you've never seen the play Chicago before, this is you could find worse ways to watch Chicago. This one is fantastic for a first time viewing. I was a little jaded as a musical theater student, but it is a good movie. I was entertained all the way through. I was a little bored because it, like any musical, it sort of meanders a little bit. And we didn't even talk about Michael C. Reilly.
Oh, John C. Reilly.
John C. Reilly.
John
C. Reilly plays the husband of Roxy, and he does the cellophane, Mr. Cellophane, which he's great in it, but he's the most pitiable character in the whole thing.
Well, in some ways, he is the most redeemable character, but you also can't sympathize with him too much because he just lets himself get walked over time and time again. At the end of her trial, there's a murder on the steps of the courthouse. One of the ladies who's already murdered somebody murders her lawyer, and she's like, "Oh, take my picture. Doesn't anybody want to take my picture?" And while she's talking, John C. Reilly's character comes up and is like, "Are you ready to go home? Let's take care of this baby together." And of course, Roxy's like, "Are you stupid? There was never a baby." and it's just the saddest moment for this poor character.
Okay, so I think we did all these pairings of films, right? And we picked the Broadway Melody and Chicago together, and we did it for a reason at the time. But I found a subtle connection between the two films that I did not expect, and I'd like to share with you now. So this musical is based off of an actual play that was the play is called Chicago, and the play was about it's a 1926 Broadway play about two real-life jazz-era murderers, Belula Anand, who is the Roxy Hart character, and Belva Gertner, who is the Velma Kelly character. Belula Anand and Belva, so Belula and Belva were both jazz-era musicians. Belula's story is exactly the same as Roxy's. She was with her lover, and they both reached for the gun, and she ended up killing her lover in a spat. Now, this Broadway play was made into a movie, a silent movie that came out in let me just get this right. In 1927. So they made a silent movie version of this story in 1927, and the woman Gertner, who is the Velma Kelly part, had not a starring role but a cameo. So the murderer, the woman who actually murdered her husband and sister, ended up getting a cameo in the movie that was based off of her own life. So she was acquitted for the murder, then got to star in her own movie, and then died some years later. But I just thought that was very interesting that very shortly after the Broadway Melody, or shortly before the Broadway Melody came out, the events of Chicago were actually taking place.
That's interesting. I thought you were going to say that Bessie Love starred in the silent movie.
No. Now that would have been a much better connection. But no, the murders that this was based on happened just a couple years before the Broadway Melody came out.
I will say the connection, the loose connection that I sort of saw while we were watching the Broadway Melody, having seen Chicago before, was that I felt like it was the precursor to Chicago, where Hank would be the Velma Kelly character who found out that her sister and her boyfriend / husband were cheating together, and so Hank was just gonna kill them at the end.
Blow your brains out and I'm going to Schenectady. I can be a star there. But yeah, so those were the two movies we watched. And a loose connection between the two, but this one's weird. It's almost like we didn't need a guest this week because we knew which movie was going to win. And you if you've listened this entire way, you probably know as well, constant listener. But let's take turns regardless. So, Sarah, which movie do you think deserves to go on to the next round this week? The Broadway Melody or Chicago?
Well, considering that I think only one of them qualifies as a full movie, I'd have to go with Chicago.
Oh, wait. There it is. I had an applause queued up. Yeah, that's enough of that. I am going to go with, yes, the actual movie that we watched, Chicago. I actually had fun watching Chicago for reasons that the filmmakers intended.
Yes, it was purposeful. Like the most of the choices in the movie, all the things you laugh at, all the things that your heart pulls at, and everything, they were purposeful choices, and it was executed with intention.
Yes, unlike the Broadway Melody, which all the fun I had in it was just how bad it was, so it just made me laugh a lot. And sure, if I was going to put Chicago and the Broadway Melody next to each other, the most fun I had watching a movie was for sure the Broadway Melody. I was goofing on it the whole time. I was laughing. There were tears streaming down my face. But I can't, in good conscience, give it to Broadway Melody. It's a terrible, terrible film by today's standards, and it will not hold up against any other movie on this series, let alone Chicago, which is a fine movie. I personally don't think Chicago is going to go on very far in the lineup, but who knows?
I guess it just depends on what we pair it up with next.
Yeah, if it gets paired up with another shitty movie, then it might go on to the next round. But I actually I got something out of my watch of Chicago. I was entertained. It was a fine movie. I'll begrudgingly say, sure, yeah, it goes on to the next round. So what are we gonna watch next week?
I think we're gonna watch Deer Hunter and Platoon.
Both films, I believe we both haven't seen.
Haven't seen them.
Yeah, so I haven't seen Platoon or Deer Hunter, nor has Sarah. Maybe we'll see if we can get RJ or another guest. Who knows? You'll just have to stay tuned and find out. But thank you for watching to the end of this episode. Feel free to subscribe to us on YouTube. We're putting up all of the episodes up there. Follow us on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever great podcasts are found. But thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Bye.